Hello guys, welcome back to my channel Legal Banter. In the previous two videos, I started by discussing movies which were good learnings for constitutional law. This is part 3 of that video. If you haven't checked out part 1 and 2, you will find the link in the description box and you will also find them somewhere on the screen. These are the movies that we have covered so far and we shall be doing the remaining in today's video. The next movie in the series is called Haider. Now this movie was released in 2014 and has Shahid Kapoor, Tabu, KK Menon and Irfan Khan in central characters. Now this movie has a bit of a dark undertone to it. As we know, all Vishal Bhardwaj movies are like that, and it bases on itself against the backdrop of the Kashmir conflicts. The insurgency hit Kashmir and the conflict that happened in Kashmir in the year 1995, where probably for the first few times the power or this conflict for autonomy started between the government and the people of Kashmir. So this movie uses that as a backdrop and it explores one of the most controversial and human rights violation related issues that seems to trouble Kashmir, which is people or civilians they go missing. Either they are picked up by the army for interrogation, or they are arrested by the army on the allegation that they are harboring terrorists, or they are accomplices, or they're using various forms of identity and they are indulging into terrorist activities. So this movie focuses on the character of Shahid Kapoor, who is troubled with the fact that his father had gone missing after he was arrested by the army that was posted in J&K, and so far he has not been able to know his whereabouts. We have other movies also which are based on similar issues. For example, there was a movie released in 2018 called as Hamid, and then we had another one coming in 2019 which was called as No Fathers in Kashmir. Now both these movies, through the viewpoint of a child and the viewpoint of a teenager respectively, explore the same idea as to how civilians go missing, their whereabouts are unknown almost all the time when the army has something to do with it. Now we tend to think as a layman that what gives army this power to do this? Now unfortunately or fortunately, the powers rest under AFSPA, or what we also know as Armed Forces Special Powers Act of 1958. Now interestingly, this is something that probably a lot of you may not know, but this AFSPA Act is something that has been subsequently incorporated and enacted for various states of India at various times, due to different reasons. When it happened for Kashmir, this happened in 1990, and therefore the AFSPA that applies to Kashmir is called as AFSPA Kashmir Act of 1990. Now it is as a result of this act that army seems to enjoy special powers when it comes to keeping and maintaining the law and order in the state. So this movie explores the humane side of it. It's not based on the perspective of army or to justify what they do and how they do it, but it is rather to humanize the entire human conflict that occurs between the state and its citizen. Now we know that United Nations had previously in 2012 had asked the Indian government to retract the provisions and the act of AFSPA because they believe that it does not go along well, it does not align well with the democratic setup of India, but the Indian government is yet to take a stand on it. The learnings from this movie that you can relate to as a student of constitutional law are threefold. Firstly, obviously, this movie will make you think, or rather rethink, about Article 370 and Article 35A of the Indian Constitution. This was recently in the news when the government, the BJP-led government, had retracted and abrogated these two provisions, whereby the state of Jammu and Kashmir used to enjoy a special status, so much so that they could have their own constitution. Almost all Indian laws did not apply to the state of Jammu and Kashmir and its people. But as a result of the abrogation, the special status has now been retracted and all powers apply in the same manner, all laws apply in the same manner as they apply to any Indian national. Secondly, this movie talks about AFSPA, the powers of army under AFSPA, the human rights violation that occur in the guise or garb of AFSPA, and why there is a very, very stringent need to regulate the same under provisions of the IPC. Interestingly, I'm sure some of you may have an idea that when it comes to army related offences or offences committed by army officers, the Indian courts, the Indian Penal Code has no role, in the sense that the prosecution of such a person cannot happen before a trial court of India. It can only happen before the designated court martial that is designed for the same purpose. And the third issue which is relevant for a student of constitutional law is to understand what is due process or what is procedure established by law, and how a draconian law, how a dictatorial law which does not have a basis in humanity, which seems to violate the most basic of human rights, how that has been justified by the government for the longest time possible, all in the garb of trying to suppress and control the people of Kashmir. The next movie is Newton. This movie was released in 2017 and stars Rajkumar Rao and Pankaj Tripathi as central characters. In this movie, the protagonist, which is played excellently by Rajkumar Rao, shows how he is assigned and sent on election duty to a Naxalite hit area in Chhattisgarh. He tries to conduct free and fair elections in such tribal areas where despite the odds being stacked against him. He is running the trouble, one, of under constant threat of being attacked by the Naxals who may not want the elections to happen, and secondly, the CRPF personals which are assigned to him in order to help and facilitate the free and fair elections don't seem too interested. And it is also shown in the climax of the movie how the main officer of CRPF is actually the one behind who had staged the entire Naxal attack, and he had tried to repudiate the elections from happening. Now this movie is actually, if you look at it, it tries to ridicule the democracy, or what we also see enshrined in our preamble as something called as a democratic setup, or we take pride in calling ourselves as a democratic republic. But this movie shows the stark reality that how even in the 21st century it is possible that people somewhere in different parts of India, especially the remote areas, still have no clue about elections, the fact that they have to vote, the fact that it is their right to vote, the fact that it is a constitutional mandate that they are supposed to do that in order to ensure and encourage the working of a healthy democracy. This movie shows that how all of this seems like a facade and the actual picture is very, very different. From a student point of view, or as a student who's focusing on learnings of law from this movie, you can probably relate to 3 points. The first point is your right to vote. Now, right to vote could usually, a lot of people tend to confuse right to vote with a duty to vote. Now, let's talk about right to vote first. Article 326 and Section 62 of our Representation of People's Act do put together allow anybody over the age of 18 in India to cast their vote wherever their name is put in the electoral list. So this assigns you a right to vote. It's your constitutional right and nobody can disallow or take it away from you. But on the converse, when we talk about a duty to vote, we do not see that being reflected anywhere in the constitutional scheme. It does not present itself as a fundamental duty nor under any other heads. However, interestingly, in 2009, the Gujarat legislature, the state legislature, they were able to introduce and pass a law called as the Gujarat Local Authorities Laws Amendment Act of 2009, whereby they mandated that the people were under a duty to vote in the elections of municipal corporations, municipalities and other local level authorities. There are a lot of countries also where there is a mandate, there is a compulsory obligation on voting, which is for example countries like Australia. And in such countries, if it is found that a person stops from voting without any justifiable reason, there is a provision for penalty. However, when we try to apply that in a democratic setup like India, we do also try to question ourselves that does actual democracy work when you're being coerced to vote? Now, voting is an essential epithet of what constitutes a democracy. But when the same is put under pressure, when you are forced to vote against your will, that is where the real problem begins. It is shown in the movie that towards the end, when there's a foreign journalist who comes into, to cover the elections that are happening, the CRPF then takes an interest and then they start to haul people into the voting booth in order to give some good footage to this reporter. So this also, it makes you question, it makes you think about the converse side of what is this right as well as versus what is this duty to vote. Second lesson that a student of constitutional law can relate to is trying to understand the budget allocation. Now, it's not a direct issue or subject in the movie, but towards the end, when Pankaj Tripathi, who plays the CRPF officer, tells him the true reason why he's not so interested in ensuring that elections do occur in the prescribed manner is because of the budgetary allocations and the restraints that CRPF has to suffer. Because, for example, he does say about how they've been asking the government to help them in procuring night vision goggles, but the government does not seem to take any interest in that. So this also sort of pulls you towards a much ignored section of the Indian Constitution, which is Article 112. Now, interestingly, the Indian Constitution does not use the word budget anywhere. Instead, it uses its synonym, which is called as the annual financial statement. Interesting, right? We tend to see this word only when we're talking about companies in corporate law. So it is under Article 112 that the budgetary allocations that the government has to lay down an estimate of what will be the expenditures under various heads for the coming financial year. So one can discuss the feasibility of that and how much of that goes towards the armed forces. We have always seen anywhere between 15 to 17% of the budget being allocated for armed forces, but I'm pretty sure that when it comes to CRPF, which is considered an ancillary or not so much an important part of the Indian armed forces, the budgetary allocations that come down to CRPF, I'm sure, will be much more severe and much more lesser than what an army officer gets. The third issue that you could relate to as a student of law is the understanding or the meaning of democracy. When we look at our preamble, it consists of various words. One of those words is what we strive to be, and it says that we strive to be a democratic republic. And the true essence of democracy lies in the people participating in choosing their own government. And how do you do that? You do that by voting. So in order to understand the true meaning and the scope of this word, this movie can be considered as a very good starting point. The final movie in my list is Article 15, and this movie was released in 2019. Now obviously this was one of my favorite movies and an obvious choice to be included in this list because the title itself suggests it's a movie of important constitutional understanding. This movie is actually based against the social backdrop of caste-based atrocities that people belonging to the lower caste tend to suffer at the hands of people belonging to the upper caste. This movie does show one actual incident in the main storyline, as well as it also mentions another real-life incident that happened in 2016, where some Dalit boys were flogged and beaten. They were paraded in the public for they had tried to enter a Hindu temple. This movie is based on the 2014 actual incident that had happened in Badaun in UP, where two Dalit girls, when they had sought a raise in their daily wage for 3 rupees from their upper caste employer, they were raped, they were beaten to death, and then they were hanged in the nearby tree. This movie, through this incident, shows the story of self-discovery and professional coming of age of this urban police officer, which is played excellently by Ayushmann Khurrana. This movie showcases that what we believe and what we have lulled ourselves into believing, that we do follow secularism. India does not suffer from caste discrimination. As people who belong to the urban elite classes, we tend to believe that nothing of that sort exists. But when you turn towards rural India and remote areas in India, even in today, in the 21st century, we do see caste-based atrocities. The incidents are multiple. In fact, something as recent in the June 2020 that happened in Maharashtra, where a couple of Dalit men were flogged, their faces blackened, and they were paraded in public because they had allegedly tried to enter a Brahmin's house. So this movie tries to focus on yet another important as well as controversial issue of our constitution, which is Article 15, specifically Article 15 Clause 1. This movie makes you, it takes you along and makes you witness the dark and the brutal reality of casteism and the problem how casteism plagues the entire rural India. This movie, as a student of constitutional law, could be relevant on two issues. There's one additional issue which you could not probably relate to constitutional law. However, you can relate it to the idea or the spirit of constitutionalism, which is based in justice and equity. So the first issue that I believe is relevant for a student of law to deliberate and talk about is the dehumanizing of people belonging to the lower caste. This movie shows how easy it becomes for people of high caste to dehumanize people of the lower caste into believing that it is their caste that gives them the right to do so. Whereas interestingly, caste is something that a human being does not have a right to choose, and yet you will rather spend your entire life defending something so superficial. The second issue that a law student can focus on, as I mentioned previously, is Article 14. Now, we need to understand as students of constitutional law that there is a very innate relationship between Article 14 and Article 15. In fact, what I mean to say is that without one, the other sort of loses its essence and meaning. Article 14 is called as right to equality, which says that the state has to treat every citizen equally and it should not discriminate. Article 15 further specifies it and mandates it on the state that the state cannot discriminate between people on various grounds, caste being one of them. Article 14 can be considered as a generic fundamental right, whereas Article 15 Clause 1 can be considered more of a specific right. 15 Clause 1 is something that should not only be on paper, but it actually needs to be incorporated in spirit and reality, and that seems like a distant reality in the near future for modern India. Finally, we reach the end of this long list. I hope the learnings that I have discussed in the movie, you will be able to relate to them and you will be able to apply them to understand and study constitutional law in a more effective manner. Also, probably the next time you catch any of these movies, as a student of law, you may want to focus on the points that I have mentioned. If you believe any movies that I should have included in the list, but I could not, please leave their name in the comment box and I shall incorporate them in my future videos. If you like the content, please like, share, comment and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell. I will be uploading regular videos every weekend, so please don't miss out the notification.